The heavy glass door of the shooting range swung shut behind her with a solid thud, sealing her inside a world that felt both strangely familiar and completely alien. The air hit her first, a thick, acrid cocktail of burnt gunpowder, sharp cleaning solvent, and the faint metallic temps of lead. It was a smell that instantly transported her back to her grandfather's farm, to the crisp autumn afternoons spent behind the barn. But here, in this sterile, concrete environment, it lacked the comforting scent of hay and earth. Here, it just smelled loud and dangerous. She clutched the soft, padded case in her hands, her knuckles white. The case was old, the dark blue fabric frayed at the seams and stained with a decade of memories. It wasn't a tactical, malcovered case like the ones she saw slung over the shoulders of other patrons. Hers was simple, unassuming, and it held the most precious thing she had left of him, his Smith & Wesson .38 special revolver. She was here today not to prove something to the world, but to feel close to him again, to hear his steady voice in her head, to remember the calm focus he taught her. Grief was a heavy, quiet thing, and she hoped the sharp, clean crack of the revolver might cut through it, if only for a little while. Her eyes scanned the lobby. Men, mostly. They moved with a kind of casual confidence she didn't possess. They talked in loud voices about muzzle velocities and grain weights, words she knew but never used with such bravado. They wore expensive-looking ear protection and shirts with logos of gun manufacturers she barely recognized. She felt like an outsider, a ghost from a different time, carrying a relic in a world of high capacity, semi-automatics. She kept her head down and approached the counter, her voice softer than she intended when she asked for a lane and a box of ammunition. The clerk, a burly man with a tired expression, barely looked up. Lane 7. Eye and ear protection mandatory, he grunted, sliding a paper target and a pair of bulky neon-orangey earmuffs across the counter. She paid quickly, her fingers fumbling with her wallet, and made her way toward the range door. The moment she stepped inside, the noise changed. The muffled pops from the lobby became a sharp staccato symphony of gunshots. Each report was a physical blow, a deep thump she felt in her chest, even through the earmuffs. The air was thicker here, hazy with smoke. Concrete walls, scuffed and pockmarked, formed long, narrow lanes. At the far end of each, a paper target hung suspended in a strange, lonely stillness. She found Lane 7 and placed her old blue case on the small metal shelf. Her hands felt clumsy as she unzipped it. There it was, nestled in the worn velvet lining. The revolver wasn't flashy. Its blued steel was worn smooth in places, revealing the silver metal beneath, a polished map of its long history. The walnut grips were dark and oil-stained from her grandfather's hands, and they fit her own as if they were made for her. It wasn't a tool of intimidation. It was a piece of history. A connection to a man who taught her that power was best expressed through quiet control, from the lanes next to her. A different kind of energy pulsed. A group of 3 men, all dressed in what looked like brand-new tactical gear, were setting up their own rifles. Their weapons were sleek, black, and angular, adorned with lasers, scopes, and complicated-looking stocks. They handled them with an easy familiarity, talking and laughing loudly over the noise. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a goatee, caught her eye. He glanced down at her Lane, at the old-fashioned revolver in her hands. A small, dismissive smirk played on his lips before he turned back to his friends. She felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She had seen that look before, the one that dismissed her before she even had a chance to speak. She tried to ignore them, focusing on her grandfather's voice echoing in her memory. Steady now. It's not a cannon. It's an extension of your arm. Breathe. The shot happens long before your finger ever moves. She loaded the 6 shiny brass cartridges into the cylinder. The metallic click-clack of each round, a satisfying ritualistic sound. She snapped the cylinder shut. The sound crisp and final in her little corner of the loud room. She raised the revolver, her arms feeling heavier than usual. The front sight post wavered slightly, a tiny blade dancing in front of the paper silhouette 25 yards away. The men next to her were firing now, their rifles unleashing a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very floor. With each burst of fire, she flinched just a little, her concentration shattering like glass. She took a deep breath, trying to find the calm center her grandfather had always spoken of, but it was elusive. The pressure of their presence, their loud confidence, and their unspoken judgment was a physical weight. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil was a sharp, familiar push against her palm. The shot was a loud crack, distinct from the booming reports of the rifles next door. She lowered the gun, her heart pounding, and waited for the target to roll forward. When it stopped, she saw her work. 6 holes dotted the paper, but they were scattered all over the silhouette's chest and abdomen. It was a mess. A child could have done better. This wasn't the tight, neat cluster she and her grandpa used to make. The ones that looked like a single, ragged hole. A muffled sound cut through the noise of her own thoughts. It was laughter. Not a full-blown guffaw, but a low, mocking chuckle. She didn't have to look to know where it was coming from. She risked a quick glance to her side. The man with the goatee was leaning against the divider, looking directly at her target. He said something to his friend, who also looked over and let out a snort. They weren't even trying to be discreet. The laughter was a weapon, aimed right at her. Her face grew hot, a flush of shame creeping up her neck. She felt small, foolish, and utterly out of place. The comforting weight of the revolver in her hand suddenly felt like an accusation. She had come here for solace, for a connection to a cherished memory. Instead, she had become a joke. The laughter was a hot needle, sharp and piercing, finding its way through the thick foam of her earmuffs and burying itself deep in her ear. It wasn't just the sound. It was the intent behind it, a casual, cruel dismissal of her effort, of her grandfather's gun, of the memory she was so desperately trying to hold on to. Her face felt like it was on fire, a prickly heat that spread from her chest all the way to the roots of her hair. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole, to be anywhere but here. Under the harsh fluorescent lights and the heavier weight of their judgment, she kept her eyes fixed on the tattered paper target. The 6 ugly holes a testament to her failure. The urge to just pack up and run was overwhelming. She could quickly shove the revolver back into its case, zip it up, and walk out without ever making eye contact with anyone. She could be back in her car, the heavy door closing out the noise and the judgment, in less than 2 minutes. But the thought felt like a betrayal. It would feel like admitting they were right, that she and her grandfather's old-fashioned ways were a joke. Taking a shaky breath, she pushed the button to send the target back down the range. As it retreated, the small, dark holes seemed to mock her, growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared into the distance. She had to try again. Not for them, but for him. For the quiet man who had infinite patience, who would spend hours with her just to get the stance right, who always said the goal wasn't to hit the target, but to find the calm center within yourself. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the cylinder. The spent brass casings were warm to the touch. She tipped the revolver, and the little metal tubes clattered into the collection tray with a series of sad, hollow sounds. Reloading should have been a smooth, practiced motion, but her fingers felt thick and clumsy. She picked up a single fresh cartridge, its brass gleaming under the lights. Her hand wavered and she fumbled, dropping it. It hit the concrete floor with a loud ping that seemed to echo in the sudden lull between gunfire. A fresh wave of shame washed over her. She bent down quickly, her cheeks burning, snatching the bullet and shoving it into a chamber before anyone else could notice. The men next to her had finished their volley. The sudden silence in their lane was almost as loud as their shooting had been. She could feel their eyes on her again. She tried to block them out, focusing on the task. One by one, she loaded the remaining 5 cartridges, the click of each one seating home sounding loud and clumsy to her own ears. She snapped the cylinder closed, the sound less confident this time, more hesitant. She raised the gun again. Her arms felt like lead. The front sight post danced wildly, a blur against the distant target. Her grandfather's voice was a faint whisper, drowned out by the pounding of her own heart in her ears. "Breathe, Clara. Just breathe." But she couldn't. Her breath was caught in her throat, a tight, anxious knot. The pressure was a physical force, pressing in on her from all sides. The man with the goatee was leaning against the divider again, his arms crossed. Watching her with an amused, almost predatory look, she squeezed the trigger. The shot went high and right, punching a hole through the top edge of the paper, completely missing the silhouette's head. The recoil felt harsher this time, jarring her entire frame. Her second shot was even worse, low and left, hitting the wooden frame holding the target up. A groan of despair escaped her lips, sound swallowed by the next deafening roar from the men's rifles as they opened fire again. It was a relentless pounding assault on her senses. Each boom, a hammer blow to her crumbling concentration. By the time she fired her sixth shot, she wasn't even aiming anymore. She just wanted it to be over. She lowered the gun, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't even need to see the target to know it was a disaster. When it came forward, it was a pathetic sight. The holes were scattered everywhere, a chaotic spray of incompetence that looked like a child's finger painting. One had missed the paper entirely. This time there was no attempt to hide their laughter. It was a full-throated, open guffaw. The man with the goatee said something to his friends, and they all turned to look, their faces contorted in smug amusement. He pushed himself away from the divider and started walking toward her. Panic flared in her chest. He was a large man, and his tactical gear made him seem even bigger. An intimidating wall of black nylon and muscle. He stopped just a few feet from her lane, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of cologne mixed with gunpowder. He crossed his arms, his biceps straining against the fabric of his shirt. "You're holding it like you're afraid it'll bite you, sweetheart," he said, his voice a loud, condescending drawl that cut through the noise of the range. His friends chuckled behind him. She didn't look at him. She just stared at her terrible target, her vision blurring as tears of frustration pricked at her eyes. She felt small and foolish, a little girl playing with her daddy's gun. "Look," he continued, taking a step closer. "That little pea shooter isn't doing you any favors. It takes a real gun to get any kind of accuracy." He gestured with his thumb back toward his sleek black rifle. "Let me show you how a real gun is handled. I can put all my shots in the black from here, no problem." The offer wasn't kind. It was a power play. He wasn't trying to help. He was trying to humiliate her further, to publicly establish his superiority and her incompetence. He was diminishing the one thing she had left of her grandfather, calling it a pea shooter. A strange hot feeling began to bubble up from deep inside her, pushing past the shame and the fear. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something else, a flicker of defiant pride. This man with his loud voice and his expensive gun knew nothing about the history in her hands, nothing about the quiet strength it represented. He just saw a woman he could easily intimidate. She finally turned her head to look at him, her eyes meeting his. He was expecting her to be cowed, to look away gratefully or accept his help with a stutter. But she didn't. She just looked at him, her face a mask of quiet resolve. She had one shot left in the box. One more chance. And suddenly, she knew what she had to do. It wasn't about proving anything to him anymore. It was about proving something to herself. It was about honoring the memory of the man who taught her that a single, focused moment was worth more than 1,000 loud, boastful words. The man's words hung in the air, thick with condescension. "Let me show you how a real gun is handled." He stood there, a smug statue of modern masculinity, expecting her to crumble, to be grateful for his unwanted attention. For a split second, she felt the old familiar wave of inadequacy wash over her. But then, something inside her shifted. It was like a key turning in a locked door. The hot bubble of feeling that had been rising in her chest finally broke, not into a scream of anger, but into a wave of pure, cold calm. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. She saw the brand new gear, the clean, unscuffed boots, the way he held his rifle like an accessory. He was a man who collected things that made him feel powerful. He had never had to earn it. Her grandfather's revolver, on the other hand, was a tool that had earned its quiet dignity over decades. It had felt the calloused hands of a man who understood that true power had nothing to do with volume or appearance. Without a word, she turned her back on him. It was a simple movement, but it felt monumental. It was a dismissal. In that moment, he and his friends and their loud, booming rifles ceased to exist. Her world shrank to the 7 feet of concrete that made up her lane. She reached into the cardboard box and pulled out the last cartridge. The brass was cool and smooth in her palm. This time, her fingers didn't tremble. They moved with a quiet, practiced purpose. She opened the cylinder of the revolver. The empty chamber stared back at her like 6 blind eyes. She placed the single shiny bullet into one of them. The click as it seated home was a small, satisfying sound in the now focused quiet of her mind. She didn't rush. She closed the cylinder with a gentle push of her thumb, the movement smooth and deliberate. This was a ritual, a dance she and her grandfather had performed countless times. It was as natural to her as breathing. She could still feel the man's presence behind her. A heavy, oppressive weight, but it no longer had the power to touch her. He was just background noise, like the hum of the lights or the distant clang of a shell casing hitting the floor. She raised the revolver, but this time her arms didn't feel like lead. They felt steady, rooted to the ground. Her feet found their natural position, shoulder-width apart, her weight balanced perfectly. Her knees bent slightly, just as she had been taught. It was all muscle memory. A gift from 1,000 afternoons spent in a sun-dappled field, her grandfather's voice was no longer a faint whisper. It was clear as a bell in her mind. "All right now, Clara. Forget everything else. Forget the world. It's just you and the sight." She took a deep breath, filling her lungs completely, the air tasting of gunpowder and resolve. She held it for a second, then let it out, slow and steady. Watching a tiny cloud of vapor escape her lips, in the cool air of the range as she exhaled, the world began to fall away. The deafening roar of the other guns faded into a distant rhythmic thunder. The man's looming presence dissolved into nothingness. The harsh, fluorescent light seemed to soften. Her vision tunneled, the edges of her sight blurring until all that remained was the small, dark silhouette at the end of the lane and in front of it. The front sight post of her revolver, she focused on that tiny blade of steel. The target became a blur, the rear sight a vague shadow. All that mattered was that single sharp point. Her mind went quiet. The anxiety, the humiliation, the anger, it all drained away, leaving behind a vast, empty space of pure concentration. This was the calm center her grandfather had always talked about. It wasn't a place you fought for. It was a place you allowed yourself to fall into. Her fingers settled onto the trigger. It wasn't a tense, white-knuckled grip. It was a gentle, firm pressure. She didn't think about the shot. She didn't think about hitting the bullseye. She didn't think about the man behind her. She simply focused on the pressure, on taking up the slack, on feeling the smooth, mechanical creep of the trigger as it moved backward. The shot happened. It wasn't a decision or an action. It was an event, a surprise. The trigger broke cleanly with a quiet click that was instantly swallowed by a single, sharp crack. The sound was different from her other shots. It was crisper, more authoritative. The recoil was a firm, controlled push straight back into her palm, not a jarring upward jerk. The revolver rose slightly and then settled back into its original position. For a moment, she held the stance, the smell of fresh gunpowder sharp in her nose. Then, she slowly lowered the gun. The silence that followed was more profound than any noise she had heard all day. It wasn't a true silence. The range was still active, but it was a pocket of quiet that had formed around her lane. The rhythmic thunder from the other lanes had stopped. The men next to her were utterly still. She could feel their eyes on her, but the feeling was different now. It wasn't mocking or judgmental. It was heavy with shock and confusion. She risked a glance to the side. The man with the goatee was frozen in place, his arms still crossed, but his body was rigid. The smug, confident smirk had been wiped from his face, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide as he stared past her, down the range. At the small paper target hanging in the distance, he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The single, sharp crack of her final shot seemed to suck all the air out of the room. It was a strange and sudden quiet, a pocket of silence so complete that it felt louder than the noise that had come before it. The rhythmic thunder from the adjacent lanes had stopped. The constant clatter of brass shells on concrete had ceased. Even the hum of the ventilation system seemed to fade into the background. It was as if someone had hit a giant mute button on the world, and all that was left was the faint ringing in her ears and the smell of fresh, clean gunpowder hanging in the air like a ghost. The man with the goatee was frozen, statue carved from arrogance and shock. His arms were still crossed over his chest, but the posture was no longer one of confident superiority. It was a rigid, defensive shell. His mouth, which had been curved in a permanent smirk, was now slightly agape. His eyes, which had been full of condescending amusement, were wide with a raw, unfiltered disbelief. He stared past her, down the long, narrow lane, his gaze locked on the small white rectangle at the far end. He looked like a man who had just watched a coin land on its edge, an event so improbable it defied everything he thought he knew. His two friends were just as stunned. They stood behind their rifles, their bodies half turned toward her lane, their expressions a mirror of their leader's confusion. The laughter had died in their throats, replaced by a heavy, awkward silence. They looked from the target to her and then back to their friend, as if waiting for him to explain what they had just witnessed, to give them a cue on how to react. But he had none. His entire persona, the very foundation of his confidence in this place, had been built on his perceived expertise. And in one silent, perfect moment, it had been utterly and completely dismantled by a woman with an old revolver. He had called a pea shooter. The silence began to ripple outward. A shooter 2 lanes down peeked his head around the divider, his curiosity piqued by the sudden lack of noise. Another man, farther down the line, paused in the middle of loading his own magazine, his eyes scanning the room to find the source of the unusual stillness. The entire atmosphere of the range had shifted. It was no longer a place of individual focus and loud, chaotic energy. It had become a single, unified audience, and all eyes were subtly, and then not so subtly, turning toward Lane 7. Even the range officer, a grizzled man who had seen everything from nervous first-timers to seasoned professionals, noticed the change. He had been leaning against his counter, half watching a security monitor. But the abrupt cessation of fire from a normally busy section of the range was a red flag. He straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the lanes. He saw the frozen men, the craned necks of other patrons, and the woman standing calmly in the center of it all, a small revolver held loosely in her hand. His professional curiosity was now fully engaged. He walked over from his station, his footsteps the only sound in the unnerving quiet. He moved with a slow, deliberate calm, his eyes taking in every detail. He didn't say anything at first, just stood behind the woman, looking down the lane. He couldn't see the target clearly from this distance, but he could see the scene. The woman, serene and composed, and the 3 men next to her, looking like they'd seen a spaceship land. He'd seen egos bruised before, but this was something different. "Let's have a look," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that didn't break the tension so much as give it a focal point. He walked over to the control panel and picked up a pair of worn binoculars that hung from a hook. He raised them to his eyes, his movements economical and practiced. For a long moment, he was perfectly still. Then, he lowered the binoculars very slowly, a look of sheer, unadulterated astonishment spreading across his weathered face. He blinked once, twice, as if trying to reset his own vision. "I'll be," he whispered more to himself than to anyone else. He stared down the lane for another second, then shook his head in disbelief. He turned to the control panel and, with a deliberate press of a button, sent the target whirry back toward them. The sound of the electric motor was the only thing that broke the spell. Every person in the vicinity was now watching, their attention wrapped on the small piece of paper gliding down the wire. It was a slow, agonizing journey. As it got closer, the details began to emerge. They could all see the messy, scattered pattern of her first attempts, the chaotic spray of holes that had prompted the laughter. It was a testament to her earlier struggle, which made what came next even more incredible. And then, the target was close enough to see the bullseye. And there it was. Not just a single hole in the center. It was a single, perfectly round hole. There were no other marks near it, no other shots even close to the inner rings. Just one clean puncturing wound in the heart of the target. The range officer waited until the target stopped. Then he reached out with a pen from his shirt pocket. He gently poked the tip of the pen through the hole. It went straight through. Then he wiggled it. The paper around the hole moved with it. There was only one hole. He looked at the woman, then back at the target, and a slow, genuine smile of respect touched his lips. "You put that last one right through the first," he said, his voice filled with awe. "That's a one-holer. I haven't seen one of those from this distance in I can't even remember how long." The man with the goatee stared at the target, his face pale. He looked at the single hole, then at the pen, then at the range officer's face, as if searching for any sign that this was a joke. There was none. He opened his mouth, and for the first time all day, no condescension came out. No smugness, no arrogance. All that came out was a single, breathless word, filled with a wonder he couldn't possibly fake. Wow. The single word, wow, hung in the air like a fragile bubble, shimmering with an unspoken weight. It wasn't a loud exclamation, but a breathy, almost reverent whisper from the man with the goatee. It was the sound of a worldview cracking. The sound of arrogance dissolving in the face of something it couldn't explain or control. His friends stood behind him, their previous smugness replaced by a kind of slack-jawed. They looked at the target with the single, perfect hole, then at her, as if she were a magician who had just pulled off an impossible trick. But she wasn't looking at them. Her attention was on the revolver in her hand. The moment the shot had broken, the intense focus had receded, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. The heavy weight of their judgment, the suffocating pressure, the burning shame, it had all vanished, blown away by the clean crack of that one perfect shot. She felt a quiet stillness settle deep in her bones, a feeling she hadn't experienced since her grandfather was alive. It was the feeling of being completely and utterly centered. She broke open the cylinder, the movement smooth and unhurried. The single spent casing fell out and landed softly in the collection tray. She didn't look at the men. She didn't look at the small crowd that had gathered. She was in her own world, a world that now consisted only of her and the old revolver. From her bag, she pulled a small worn cloth and a tiny bottle of cleaning solvent. This was the ritual that always came after shooting with her grandfather. They would sit on the tailgate of his truck, the sun setting behind the hills, and meticulously clean the gun, talking about everything and nothing. It was a time of quiet connection. As she began to wipe down the barrel, the silence in her lane was finally broken. The man with the goatee took a hesitant step forward. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at his friends, who just shrugged, completely out of their depth. He tried again. "How? I mean, that was..." He stumbled over the words. The confident, condescending drawl completely gone, replaced by a fumbling, genuine curiosity. She paused her cleaning and looked at him, not with anger or triumph, but with a calm, level gaze. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than any retort could have been. It wasn't a cold or dismissive silence, but a peaceful one. A boundary that quietly said this moment was not for him. He seemed to understand. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of respect. "That's some beautiful shooting," he finally managed to say, his voice quiet. "Truly." He didn't apologize for his earlier behavior, but the shift in his entire demeanor was a confession in itself. He and his friends quietly packed up their own gear. Their movements subdued, their earlier loud bravado replaced by a humble quiet. They left without another word, shooting her one last look that was no longer mocking, but filled with a newfound and slightly bewildered respect. The range officer, who had been watching the whole exchange, gave her a small, knowing smile. "Your grandpa teach you that?" he asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, a faint smile touching her own lips for the first time. "He did. He'd be real proud," the officer said simply. Then he turned to walk away, giving her back her space. She finished cleaning the revolver with the same care and attention her grandfather had taught her. Every part was wiped, every surface inspected. It was no longer just a task. It was an act of love, a final conversation with the man she missed so much. She could almost hear his voice, not in words, but in a feeling of deep, abiding pride that washed over her. He hadn't just taught her how to shoot a gun. He had taught her how to find the calm in the storm, how to shut out the noise and listen to herself. Today, for the first time without him there, she had finally heard it. She carefully placed the revolver back into its old, frayed blue case. The worn fabric felt different now, not like a sign of being outdated, but like a comfortable, well-loved blanket. It was a symbol of a different kind of strength, one that didn't need to shout to be heard. She zipped it up, the sound a final, satisfying click. As she walked out of the lane, the other shooters watched her. There were no smirks, no condescending glances. There were only nods of acknowledgement, quiet gestures of respect from people who understood the magnitude of what she had just done. The heavy glass door swung open, and she stepped back into the lobby. The world outside the range seemed brighter, clearer. The acrid smell of gunpowder was gone, replaced by the clean, ordinary scent of the world. The weight of the gun case in her hand felt familiar and comforting, a solid anchor to a newfound sense of self. She had walked into the range feeling small and lost, a ghost haunted by grief and defined by the judgment of others. She was walking out as someone else. She was a woman who carried her grandfather's legacy not just in her hands, but in her heart. Driving home, she didn't turn on the radio. She just drove in the quiet. The events of the afternoon replaying in her mind, not with a sense of victory, but with a deep, profound peace. The men's laughter, which had felt like such a weapon, now seemed distant and unimportant. It had been the very thing that had pushed her to find that calm center, to filter out all the noise and listen only to the lessons of the past. Their attempt to diminish her had inadvertently given her the space to become bigger. She realized the one shot hadn't just changed everything on that paper target. It had changed everything inside her. It hadn't magically erased her grief, but it had carved out a space within it where strength and confidence could grow. It was a single, perfect point of focus in a messy, chaotic world. A reminder that even when everything is scattered and loud, there is always a place of stillness to be found. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she could find it again anytime she needed to. The laughter had tried to define her, but her one perfect shot had redefined her for herself, and that was all that mattered.